Will, let's do some introductions because I've
Yeah.
just been introducing and saying like, hey, it's Will. You know, I gave I showed up the LinkedIn page of you, and it's just like you're a recruiter. But I think you've done more than recruiting in your life, and you're more than just a recruiter. So introduce yourself.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the opportunity and just, yeah, good to be able to share hopefully a little bit of insight on behind the scenes and hopefully give some folks some valuable insight to grow in their careers. My career, yeah, I'm a recruiter through and through. So 7 years deep in it now. And I plan to keep doing this for another 20 years. So definitely a career recruiter. I think a lot of people come in and out of the industry. And that's okay. It's definitely a place I plan to be for a long, long time. So in that sense, I'd call myself a student of the game, a student of the practice, relationship based. But before that, and I don't advertise this a lot, because then I get bombarded with, will you write my resume? And my answer is no, but I'm happy to send you a link to some other good resume writers. But I ran a resume writing business for 7 years. Some of that, I was very, very good at the actual resume writing piece. I did a lot of interview coaching in that. And that was, pretty self-taught, but, one of the higher priced and higher value, I think, resume writers out there. So I did that for about 5 years before. So the career space has been where I've lived. That story is a whole other story on its own. I had 5 jobs in 8 months. I was really good at getting jobs. I didn't like any of them, and my wife kind of accidentally threw me into the fire. I was talking about starting this resume writing business, and she told a friend of a friend that I had one, and so that day, I guess I wrote my first resume, and 6 years later, I had a little firm that ran it, which I ended up selling. But I like this path a little more. It's different. But it definitely related. So some of the things that I still build on though is really on the, we'll call it personal marketing side, right? I mean, to over borrow I think a lot of people think recruiters help people get jobs. I would actually say most often the inverse is true, which is sometimes frustrating for folks I know, right? I help jobs get people. So the resume writers, career coaches, I'd still try to bring that approach where my job was to help people get jobs. And I still try to bring that one-on-one approach. And I think the best recruiters do, right? They're going to have that hand holding. And not just myself. I know a lot of other good recruiters locally and others that they're going to help take care of you along the way, whether or not they have a job for you. So it's a delicate balance. We can get flooded, and try not to be I could fill my calendar every day with those kind of things, but try to help more in areas like that. So that's, yeah, long version of kind of where I come from. And yeah.
Well, and I think that also shows like a pretty big difference between some other recruiters that I met in the past where they didn't get into it from this like long line of like starting with resumes and then going up like throughout the process of getting jobs and then like having that passion. I've met plenty of recruiters that are just like, oh, I was a developer or I was a salesperson and now I'm in the
Yeah.
recruiting business too. And it's actually really nice to see somebody who is going in there because that is their passion and that they really care about it.
Yeah. I think that, I'd almost say that the closest field I think to a really, really good recruiter is real estate, right? We are a connector of, buyer, seller. And the idea is to find something that matches for everyone. And so we can do buy side, we can do sell side. But the best ones are truly matchmakers, not, I think sales is almost, you can do well in recruiting with a sales background, but I almost don't like that because I think that's why recruiters get such a bad reputation, and we earn it. I think I'd say 9 out of 10 recruiters are bad, and unfortunately, there's been a culling of that market, over the last year and a half because it's been so hard. It's hard for developers and it's harder, I'd say, even for recruiters in this market. And so that means people leave in droves as fast as they came in. They're leaving, which is actually good. I think the overall quality of recruiters that are left in the market probably went up a lot over the last year and a half. So, yeah.
Yeah, I can definitely believe that. All right, well let's get into some questions here because we got a bunch rolling in, and I'll probably prioritize people who are here live, but I have some that have come from the community sort of like previously who I don't know if are able to
Yeah,
join right now. So
of
Omnifidus
course.
right away has just sort of asked, what's the going rate for having a resume written?
Yeah, and I will send a link over. There's a lady named Amy Miller, and she does a lot in recruiting, dispelling recruiting myths. She has a blog of her own, writes a lot. So I'm going to defer to her link if you're actually looking for folks. She's got about 20 different options. Some folks actually in there. I trained 7 years ago, 8 years ago. So cool to see some of the folks. But going rate, you're not going to like it, but 150. It's probably bottom. I'd say 250 to 350 is about average for a good one. But just because you pay more in resume, it's kind of like recruiting, right? No barrier to entry. Lots of people do it. I think because they have an English major, and they know how to spell and grammar. They're a good resume writer. And I honestly was the opposite. I still can't spell or grammar. I paid someone to do that for me. I think a good resume writer is actually more of a marketing professional, right? They're really trying to understand your story and convey it in a compelling way. So it's less about the blocking and tackling of individual words. No one's reading your resume; they're skimming it, right? So I'd say, it's been a minute since I've really looked into it, but I mean, I was charging $750 for a resume, starting point, and then LinkedIn was another 500. I was top 10%, this is 6-7 years ago, of the market. I think you can have a really good resume writer for less. It's hard to look at. I think the best thing I would do if I was vetting one is I would look at a few before and afters. I think that even to an untrained eye, if you see a before resume and an after resume, not just the after resume, that's the best way to look and go, is this person any good? Can you see the transformation happen? So yeah, I probably 250, 300 is probably starting point of somebody who's pretty good. 150, a lot of times there's a couple big shops that outsource it all. So they'll have someone do an intake call and then they'll spit it out. And some of those are, the parent company might be taking $100 and then they're paying somebody $50, which you're not going to get the time you need. So there's a long version of, what I'd pay.
All right. Awesome. So
have you, Brooks, I'm curious, have you been exposed to the resume writing world? Does that surprise you, or is that more or less than what you thought?
Well, I've chatted with you before about that, and you had told me your prices, and you had told me that you started at like 150, and then you had like a consultant who told you if you want to like get better clients, raise your prices, and then everything just sort of went better from there.
Yeah.
And I have had that same advice to me for consulting too, where it's like, if you want to get better clients, charge more. And it's something that over here in the United States, it's like pretty common. And if you're from like a country that doesn't have like, isn't in that world, and where like 150 just is like an insanely large amount of money, is probably going to blow your mind. But that's sort of like what ends up happening over here a lot. Things are very expensive, especially higher quality things.
Yeah. And I think the one thing folks don't think about there, I think there's two reasons why that works. And I believe that's a universal principle across most industries. But one is, when it hurts a little bit, you're going to listen to my advice. So I actually think my resume didn't get any better when I, started charging 250 and then 500 and 750. It was the same resume, but people actually listened to what I said, and they would kind of respect the process a little more. And so it works better for them because they were actually implementing the things versus the person that was looking for bottom of the barrel, cheapest way to do that. But then the second piece, see if I can remember my train of thought on this. Come back to me. But no, I appreciate your insights on that.
All right. Let's go into one of the previous Discord questions from Blah, which was educational requirements for getting one's foot in the door.
Yeah. And we're talking specifically in software engineering, correct?
Yes, software engineering, regardless if it's going to be a software engineering company focused on that, or if it's just a software engineering job at a company.
Yep. You're going to get the rawest and what hopefully truest version of the picture that I see, right? I'm just one recruiter, and I run a recruiter meetup, and I'm connected with others. So hopefully my opinions reflect that of the market as a whole. But I'd also be wary of the fact that this is just one sliver of the market. But I am certainly a big believer that functionally on the job, this is a personal opinion, maybe not actually answering the question, which I will get to. That functionally on the job, I don't know that formal education makes a huge difference. To the point where, I have my son, he's 6, and he's starting to do some robotics and Python coding, and he's having a ton of fun with that. And but I don't know that I'm going to push him to go to school, right? If he wants to, great, I'm all for that. If he doesn't want to, that's also great. I don't know that, especially in the software engineering space, and the same with my daughter, in a lot of the technical fields, I think passion is just as important. You can find the information, right, on most things. So if you're excited about it versus a degree, if you're not excited about it, then dad paid for it, and you're just kind of using it because I pushed you. I don't know if I feel great about that. On paper, all else being equal, I will share though, about 50 or 60% of my clients will look for a computer science degree. And so that will be a fundamental. Not all, and many of those that look for that as a preference and do believe that those fundamentals, matter. A lot of those are very open to folks who have proven their experience on the ground, who have proven their experience in production. And once you're past the, I'm going to make up a number here, but somewhere in the 4 to 7 year mark, they kind of don't really care what your education is. So it is a bonus. Sometimes it feels like though that bonus matters a lot more in San Francisco and New York backed companies if they're venture capital backed. But certainly it can help a lot. And I think the knowledge is what matters most. So I'm looking at the question here. Yeah. Can you read the question again? I want to make sure I actually address it directly and not indirectly here.
That question was, what are the educational requirements for getting one's foot in the door?
Yeah. I think I generally encourage people, if you have an option and if your choice is to go pursue either education or go build something, go build something. I think that's the case every time, right? I think it's a great foundation to look at your production experience. But I'm a recruiter and I'm an external recruiter, meaning people only come to me when they're looking for someone with usually 5 years or more minimum experience. So that does disqualify my taste of the world in kind of the, we'll call it entry and mid-level roles. So those roles do exist, and I think that is some kind of a degree of boot camp, or a degree is certainly going to help you on those early stage roles. However, people want to see what you built, right? And that can be a hobby, that can be a project, that can be open source contributions. Oftentimes that's more highly favored, especially on your first pass, right? I do believe that if you've built something within school, awesome. If you've built something outside of school, maybe even more awesome. Yeah, I'm going to say 50%. Don't worry about education too much. If it helps you build projects, do that. But yeah.
Well, I guess that leads to sort of like another question right now, which is, I'm not good at networking. Any advice on that?
Oh, yeah, I got 2 words. Be curious. Be curious. I think, and we've met several times in person, Brooks. I think you may be surprised. I've probably actually told you this before. I hate networking. I think I'm actually good at it, but I despise it. Going out, meeting new people, new faces who don't know me, and you're putting yourself out there. But I think networking lies in the power of the questions you ask, and not so much in the things you say, because everyone likes to talk about themselves. Everyone likes people that are curious about them. And as soon as you can open the door, and sometimes that means writing a list of 2 or 3 things, it's, hey, Brooks, why Rust? Why do you love Rust? And we can have a conversation for an hour about that, but because I'm genuinely curious. That's not a tactic. That's what is it about Rust that intrigues you over other things? Or, why streaming when other people are content to just, stay, genuine curiosity is the foundation of all networking. And as much as I hate it, I think I've become pretty good at it. And some of it's just practice, right? You just got to get out. But I think that you can call it networking like the face-to-face, but there's also the networking virtual like this, getting in Slack groups. I've found also that Slack groups, chat groups, either virtual communication helps build a foundation on which to launch. So, hey, I may go to a networking meeting once a month, but when I go there and I know 2 or 3 or 4 people virtually that I've never met, but I see that face and they see my face and they go, hey, I actually know that guy. That's that bald recruiter guy. And we're able to have a conversation based off of a digital relationship. It really opens that door for networking. So going back, be curious, be curious about other people. And I think that opens a ton of doors.
Nice. I completely agree with that. Being curious also makes it really easy to ask leading questions for others, right? You want them to talk more than you talk. So
yeah.
All right. Let's see. Another question that we had a little bit earlier. How is the market right now? Are there more AI jobs than programming jobs?
How is the market? Are there more AI jobs than programming jobs? This is one where I have to be careful because I do not want to represent the market as a whole. You have to keep in mind recruiting comes into play. So the stuff that I see all day, every day is the areas that we'll call it that hurt. When someone is struggling to find talent, so I'll use an example even from when the market was great. There's probably 10 C#.NET Microsoft Stack jobs in comparison to every Ruby on Rails job. That said, I might have had it an inverse. I probably had 10 Rails jobs open for every Microsoft role because there's a lot more Microsoft developers. There's a lot more of those jobs and they fill on their own. They don't need help, right? But when someone comes to a recruiter like me, it's because they are struggling to find said talent. And so the pain point was much stronger in Rails than it was in Microsoft in order to find folks. So they were willing to go find. They were willing to pay me to help them find said talent. So the market has really hurt. I think it probably hurt more for me and more for my peers in the recruiting world than is an actual picture of the market, right? Data. We've continued to stay in pretty low unemployment rates. I tend to specialize in venture capital, which got hit extra hard. So it does feel like the market is making a turnaround. The data I use, not Levels, TrueUp. If you haven't, and I'll try to keep a list of all the links I need to send out. TrueUp, there's a layoff tracker and a market tracker. But the market tracker has started to trend up. So I think at its peak, according to Open Tech Jobs, there was some 500,000 almost, and we've kind of floated in the 210,000 in the last year and a half. The tiny little uptick, right? So it's starting to feel better. I think there's two things at play that people aren't thinking about a lot. One is just election cycle. I think that there is a lot coming back with venture capital, with Fed continuing to make money more accessible. I think that's going to really push money back into tech. But I think folks that even recruiters forgot about, because it's every 4 years, there's a huge slowdown across hiring across industries pre-election or the 6 months before election. It's not about pick one side or the other. It's really more about uncertainty. When people don't know what's going to happen, they tend to just hold on to their money and do nothing, which means the market slows, it stalls. And so because of the election cycle right now, I think that regardless of who gets elected, in the US at least, we are going to see a pickup after that. And that's historically, talking to the recruiters that I know, in and out of the tech industry, they see that every single time. And we forget that because the last election cycle was COVID. So we weren't really thinking about election. We were thinking about COVID. And so it's a little bit distracting to what happened to the market then. I am at the very worst hopeful and at the very best optimistic that the market's making a big turnaround. I don't think we're going to go back to 2022, 2021 kind of numbers. But I think if you've been waiting for it to pick up, we're probably close.
That's good. I mean, it's obviously hindsight is always best. Like we know what happened in the past. It's hard to predict the future, but having, someone like you being optimistic is it's a good data point.
Yeah.
So OmniFootus asks a good sort of like follow-up question here, which is, aren't AI jobs the same as data science jobs? And when you're seeing AI jobs versus data science jobs versus programming jobs, are you seeing those as like different separate things? Or are you seeing sort of like AI and programming together and data science separate? Or just, how does that look for you?
For me personally, I I see them run in parallel. I don't do a lot of data science work. I'm doing more machine learning and AI work, usually meaning the companies I'm working with are an AI focused company, right? Because I do a lot of venture capital, obviously there's a ton of money right now flowing into early stage venture capital backed AI companies. And so because of that, I've gotten a little more into data science. I don't know that I can talk the data science talk as well as I'd like. So part of that's just where I specialize and where I've been known is definitely more on the programming side, which has bled more toward the machine learning side as well, and a little bit out of the data science. But the two run in parallel as far as what the market's doing. If you're building a team, you're building a team, right? And the jack of all trades is the first person you hire when you're a team of one, right? Somebody that somehow magically can do it all. And then you start building, hey, we'll add a couple data scientists. But those worlds, even for the folks that are experts in it, to data science managers, frankly, I think there's a lot of confusion right now about where the crossover is between data science and machine learning and software engineering. Because title-wise, I'm running a search right now for a full stack data scientist, which in and of itself is an odd title, right? It's kind of it's a data science or a full stack developer. And I think that it's probably a really good picture of the market doesn't really know, right? The manager doesn't really know. He knows he wants for machine learning, fundamentals. And there's some data science and there's some programming, but I think those worlds continually blend together.
Awesome. Okay, let's take a well, actually, let's do. Here's a question that's sort of like a blending and maybe a good transition question. How is the AI boom affecting non-AI focused either industries, companies, or just jobs?
Yeah, not a good predictor, right? If I'm betting on myself, I wouldn't put money where I say, but it certainly feels like the AI boom has almost created a polarization, right? There is a ton of innovation happening with AI, and there's a ton of new business within business that's opening on AI. But what I feel like in contrast is it feels like the middle market is almost getting missed, and really interesting, what I'll call older or more traditional markets are also exploding, right? It feels like in the same time AI is going up crazy, I'm seeing a ton more in robotics. I'm working with a lot of legal tech startups that I haven't seen ever or in many years. I've only come across a few, and all of a sudden there's a ton. Farm technology, I'm seeing that blow up. And sometimes the intersection, they're in, right? There's one that I came across and had some really good conversations with that was using AI to help farmers write grants for some, what a weird intersection, right? AI and farming. So I'm seeing a ton of that. Another one that was a janitor company. So I think it's interesting to see some of these kind of old or forgotten markets pick up at the same time as you're looking at the bleeding edge. You're also looking at some of the just like backbone of, we all eat and we all do legal stuff and taxes, and some of the more what I would call boring and less sexy type of industries are also making a boom or are booming right now. So it will be interesting to look back in 5 years and see where each of those came about. But certainly does feel like the AI side is almost pushing folks to run the contrarian side as well.
Let's see. Okay, so Omnifuda says, when you study AI at the University of Wisconsin, it is in the College of Data Science, which draws on computer science, statistics, and a couple of others. Will is not super focused on this area. I'm guessing using AI to help farmers use grants is not an AI job. It's a programming job. So this brings in a really good sort of like distinction between programming and creating AI, sort of like the data science-y part of it, or using AI as a programmer, because I can use AI by implementing AI systems and tools, but I have not created the AI myself. Even if I fine tune an AI, I am not necessarily doing like the data science part of it.
Yeah, every bit of that sounds correct. And again, I would agree. I don't specialize there, so I think it's an important and noted distinction. I think when I'm talking about AI and in general, I'm probably talking more about AI enabled companies than actual AI itself, or AI jobs. I don't know that I've ever actually taken on a real AI job. And I would say even more, right? The fundamentals of machine learning is probably where I tend to specialize a little bit more. How are we using machine learning to enable programming, versus AI jobs?
Right. Awesome. Okay, well that allows us to sort of transition into some non-software software specific jobs. So,
Mhm.
one question here is, which non-software focused industry currently has the most software related jobs in your opinion?
Non-software focused industry has the most software related jobs. I don't know if I would say this is a non-software industry. I don't know that I'm going to be able to answer that well. I think two industries come to mind, but one could say they are very software adjacent or software related. Fintech, it certainly feels like there's a lot in fintech, and I think that depends on the company. Some of those companies are very software focused, right, and are truly tech companies, and some are absolutely not, right. And I, all else being equal, if I'm a software developer, I am going to try to stay in a tech focused company where somebody sees me as a path to the future, not just a necessary evil, right? And not that either are bad, but I'm gonna. It does feel like the market when it tightened, there was a lot of the loss of jobs with non-tech companies that were pushing out folks that they thought, hey, we can shrink this cost center versus, when it's central to what they do and they need to sell it and it needs to be right. If that piece is broken, then that person is needed and they needed to be exceptional, right? So fintech is one I've seen a lot of. Some of that's just banks, right? Mortgage company stuff, just regular. Some of it's payments. I've seen the payments industry do well, although I'd argue that's probably a little more software focused. And then the second one that came to mind, I don't know if it's a strong answer, but health tech, and some of that again is fundamentals within a hospital, which I would call not really a software industry. But then there's a lot of health tech that is, it's a health. They're selling a product that is sold to hospitals, right? Which is, I would call that absolutely a software job. So I think, and then some companies bleed in between, but certainly feels like those are two industries that aren't purely software, that are taking up a lot of the market right now.
Yeah, I would probably agree with that. I see a lot of hospital like healthcare based jobs and companies recently. Although a lot more sort of on a startup side than on the sort of like the larger company side. So the
Yeah,
question of like how many jobs can you get there might be a little bit limited until those companies sort of get bigger.
yeah. And then there's always the intersection, right? As you're sharing that, I'm thinking about kind of the robotics world, and in Boulder, in our area here, there's for example, Sunday. It's grass, an eco-friendly, grass and fertilizer company, right? But they have tons of software jobs. So, I'm seeing the robotics, or I've seen that intersection of, again, we can just call it farming or grass or robots. But I've seen that the robotics world do some interesting things. And some of those are true programming jobs, right? It is a little bit more embedded software, and then it starts to bleed. Which one where do you define the software line? Whether it's robotics operating systems, but seems like that's a booming industry. Things that you can physically touch, and build, not just a digital product.
Yeah, and I think that's something that some companies, like having talked to some non-technical founders, so sometimes they forget that there is software in IoT. There is software in all of
Yeah,
our cars. There is software in our refrigerators now. It's everywhere.
yeah. And then there's the interface, right? I mean, I worked with a company that made balloons, and so their entire product is balloons that are going up into the stratosphere, and they're doing mapping with it, and they're looking at weather. But you and I still have to interact with that. The end user still has to interact with the data, and so they have a pretty substantial, and very strong software team. Um, and I think in the tech boom that we had over the last 2 or 3 years, everything that venture capital was investing in was something that's digital and very scalable, and you can grow it 10x or 100x, overnight. And I think that there's been a little bit more of a humbling there where people are now much more interested in something that is not going to go away, which is our refrigerators and our lawnmowers and our grass. Because as fast as it can go up, it can come down as fast, right? And I think that the market is appreciating a little more slow, steady growth in general. And yeah.
I love Omnifitus's joke. I don't work on cold software. No smart refrigerators for me. All right.
No cold software, frozen software.
Okay, let's talk about some like the act of getting the job and some things that are like both good and potentially really bad here. So one question was, what can you comfortably say about ageism in tech?
Yeah. What can I say about ageism in tech? It's very real. It's very, very real. And, one of my least favorite words to hear from a hiring manager, and something I hear a lot, is culture fit, right? Or culture add, because at some fundamental level, people hire people they like, right? That is truth. Like you want to work with people you like, but we can talk about any kind of ism, and but I don't know, that word culture fit so often feels to me like a clouded way to discriminate on age, and so it's something that really more going back to my resume writer roots. I strongly encourage folks. It's a little adage I used a lot: is if it doesn't help, take it out, right? And so often, a resume would be written, and people want to talk about, and this is not non-software. This is a personal friend of mine, right, that I work with. So this will be a good example. But he spent 12 years 15 years-ish in international sales. And then he moved into an analytics job for 5 years, and then he did international sales again. And he wants to stay in international sales, but he had a 2-page resume, and 1 page of that was taken up by the analytics component. And so as you look at that resume and you look at the story, you're like, sales guy or analytics guy or sales guy? Well, it was an easy fix for me because I spent 6 years doing it. I said, well, let's just don't lie. Keep those jobs in there and don't talk about them, right? Make it very clear from the physical amount of the page that you're taking up who you are and what you want to be. And so, my general encouragement is, just take it out, right? And that was his example. But for, I think to help reduce discrimination there, don't lie if somebody asks, but you can eliminate jobs that don't matter, right? You can use the plus signs big, right? You can say 25 plus years experience as a developer, or you can say 15 years plus years experience. Both are true. And there are ways to help people focus on the things that matter, which is, can you do the job and will you do the job well, instead of focusing on things that don't matter, being what you did 27 years ago. So it's very real. And there are some very real ways you can help eliminate the propensity for those things to happen, especially in VC, right? It's very real, and I'd like to say, it's not as simple as this. I'd like to say the companies that are discriminating that way, you don't want to work for them anyways, but that does feel like a little bit of a cop out for me to say that. It doesn't change the systemic issue at all.
Well, yeah, and it brings it's an interesting problem, because there's the purposeful exclusions. That's probably the companies you don't want to work for, is the ones who literally create a policy saying no people older than, I don't know, some arbitrary age. But then there's the people who are not necessarily trying to be exclusive. Sometimes they feel that they are being inclusive, but they still have implicit biases that will affect them during the entire hiring process. And I don't know if you have any suggestions for that, like for working with that as a software engineer trying to get a job.
So I guess maybe rephrase the question for me there. How do we, as job seekers, try to help the hiring manager eliminate
or
accidental bias?
How to, it's like how not necessarily to help them, because like as a job seeker, I don't really feel I can help them, but how do I work around this problem?
Yeah. It's exceptionally difficult. It is exceptionally difficult. I wish I had a lightning answer. I think the problem is that the problem exists, right? And so it's almost unfair to put the onus on the person doing the application. And really, the change happens on the hiring manager side, not on the applier side. So then it feels like we are anything we do is we're trying to make their evil less evil, right? And as a person who wants the job, like do what you got to do, be honest. But I don't know that I have a lot of specific advice. I think those are more things that on the hiring side, right? There are ways to kind of give blind look at resumes, right? And so some of us are doing things like that, or there are ways to compare side by side technical challenges, right? So that we're looking at the function of what you do versus the implicit bias that we're going to have. And so, companies that, and that's hard, right? I work with a lot of small companies. And so companies that have 3 people, it's hard to add that to your process of, how we're going to evaluate hires here. And so, I think in some ways, theoretically larger companies should be better at that, and I think in general they are. Not always. There's a lot of exceptions there, but yeah.
Yeah, to add my 2 cents in, I would probably argue, like, going way back to that networking sort of like question slash discussion. Networking is the way to get around it as best as possible. It's like, I guess there's no really way around it. It's more of like, to me, networking gives us a second chance, like a free second chance in a company. Because if you can get somebody on the inside to like you as a person, then there's a
Mhm.
better chance that they're going to like actually pay attention to you as a person, as opposed to just, another candidate.
Yeah, yeah. I think also talking about your future is a way that really helps. I think sometimes I've seen ageism come into play where the manager is legitimately concerned that you're going to retire in 1 year and then they have to retrain someone, right? And if you tend to work for another 3 years or 5 years or 7 years, like make that explicitly clear. Sometimes I think I've seen it be helpful for job seekers to quote unquote hide kind of their age to help eliminate some of that implicit bias. But I think sometimes just tackling the fear in the room head on also helps. And so I think that, I think that explicit statement that's like, I've seen that help where I felt there was a perceived bias, and then someone tackling the actual reason why the bias is an issue, right? I don't want to retrain someone in 2 years, right? Well, let's take that out of the equation, and then I don't care if you're 90 or 70 or 50 or 20, right? Like, I just want somebody who's going to be in this role for 5 to 7 years, and that's a whole interesting thing in of itself. We work in tech. Who works for 5 to 7 years at the same company? But I do think there is a traditionalism that we all like to pretend like we're going to stay at a company for 5 to 7 years, and managers like to think that, even though they're not going to be there either. But I think, playing into that assumption sometimes helps for anyone at any age. Yeah,
Yeah, I agree. And
yeah. I feel like
Omnifritis, oh,
yeah, to Amnif's question there or comment, Silicon Valley especially. I mean, that I grew up in a farm town, right? So my dad was at the same company for 30 years. And so when I started working in tech, I remember that was the biggest shocker to me. I asked a bunch of folks in San Francisco, I was recruiting on a San Francisco role. And I said, why are you looking? And they said, I've been here 3 years. And I said, no, but why are you looking? And they said, I've been here 3 years, like as if I was completely crazy for not understanding that it was time. And, 100% knew that 3 years or 4 years. And I think talking about either telling me you plan to stay, or if you don't, don't lie. Again, I want people to be honest, but I think talking about the fundamentals, you can avoid the question with saying, hey, the things that would keep me interested for 5 to 7 years in the future would be interesting technical challenges, staying cutting edge, right? I'm making stuff up here, but I think you get the idea. If you talk about the ideology of what would keep you at a place for 5 to 7 years, that allows both you and the hiring manager to live in the stream as if you would stay there. And maybe you do, right? I mean, maybe they do, but I think talking about the principles behind, what keeps you engaged at work is a really good way to be both honest and talk about the future as an interviewee. And shoot, maybe you can have 3 jobs within the same company that bring, every 3 years that bring those new challenges that you might need. And it doesn't have to change. I mean, companies change too, right? So there's some elements of that that I've seen really keep folks engaged and keep managers interested in them.
Omnifidus actually has a really good point here, which is that while there is a lot of job hopping, there also is a lot of job staying still in the industry. Well, in all the industries. Like, for example, CEO of NVIDIA has many of the original people from 30 years ago still there. And that is something that I have noticed myself. Like, when I've been a manager at some companies, people will stay longer than like they might normally stay otherwise because they have good managers, because they really like the product. There's a lot of reasons for people to stay, as well as a lot of reasons for people to jump.
Yeah. And it obviously doesn't apply to all aspects of life. But one thing I deeply believe, I have to say this the right way, I don't believe people should always be interviewing. I think that, if you're always keeping an eye out, I think you should be open if something better presents itself. But, as a recruiter and talking to, thousands of managers, right? If your resume is you had one year job, 1 year job, 1 year job, 1 year job, 1 year job, the manager is going to assume the problem is you, right? If you had 1 year job, 6 year job, 2 year job, 1 year job, 6 year job, it's a lot easier to tell a story in which those companies went under or those managers were not good or there was a reason, right? Because you've proven that you can be a person who's fixed for a minute. So I think that is very true. But the piece I wanted to come back to in that is it's almost a problem where I've come up with a recruiting strategy for this. I encourage folks who have been at a company, we'll say 6 years or more, I encourage them to take interviews with companies they are dead certain they're not going to want the job, that even if offered, they weren't going to take it. Because, and the most vivid example of this that happened, excuse me, I talked about Ruby on Rails jobs. I had a Ruby on Rails candidate who was very good. He was at same companies for 8 or 9 years. I knew he was exceptional. And I had 7 open positions that he could apply to. And this was 3 or 4 years ago. And so I've adjusted my strategy since. He selected his favorite 5 and we got him interviews at all 5. And he was second man out 4 times in a row. And we had went with best company first. So his 5th out of 5, he ended up getting that job and he's still there. He likes the job. It's okay. But I think we did it wrong. I think that he hadn't interviewed in 7 or 8 years. He was rusty. He was a very good developer. I knew it. He knew it. And I think he was second man out because he was good enough at his job that overcame the fact that he was very rusty in interviews, right? And so we can talk about it's the skills of, whether it's elite code, whether it's a pair programming, a whiteboarding exercise, whether it's the interpersonal stuff, it's the being curious, it's the conversation, they don't like you quite as much. In a competitive market, interviewing is a different skill than being a good developer. And unfortunately, being a good developer does not mean you are going to get the job. I mean, we always say, that internally, it's not 100% true, but the most prepared candidate gets the job, not the best. And that kind of sucks, especially if you're the best, right? But the nice thing is, you can be the most prepared and beat out a lot of people. So, I believe deeply that if you don't plan to stay at your company forever, every once in a while, go take a couple interviews. And one of two things happens. You take the interview and you go, I have it good, I'm going to stay, or you take the interview and you go, man, I thought I had it good, but it's actually better on the other side. Maybe I should do a little more of this. And either way you decide, you've landed at, I am less rusty at interviews. I kind of still know what's going on. My process isn't 8 years old, and it helps so that when that perfect job does come along, and that's a lot of what I do is I go tag people that aren't looking and say, hey, I know you're not looking, but this job is probably an upward move. But is the job right for you, and can you get it are 2 different things. And so hope that it gives some insight to folks of like, don't be interviewing every month, if you're happy. I'm not suggesting that you should, but keeping that saw sharp is a very valuable skill to have when the time is right. I've seen that hit people that I believe deeply were the right person for the job, and we couldn't get them across the line. And so I take that very personally as advice to the market in general.
Let's focus in on that like strategy of getting a job, because you and I both know we've anybody who's like gotten multiple jobs in the software world knows that the act of getting a job has almost nothing to do with the act of programming itself, because interviewing is just it sucks, and it sucked for a long time. What are you seeing as trends? Like, are you seeing more or less or the same level of like whiteboarding interviews, leak coding, things like that? What are you seeing?
Yeah. There's a regression to the mean, right? So 2.5 years ago, when I think the job market, the candidates, the developers had the leverage, there were a lot more jobs available than there were people, right? And so in most cases, in order to try to attract the best talent, companies were shrinking their interview process. They were following practices that candidates wanted more. And it was usually much more streamlined. I would say easier, but a lot of it was just the time and effort that went in. So what I'm seeing now is the inverse of that, right? So I'm seeing actually a lot of companies go back to practices that I don't love. I don't have a lot of influence on, but I'm seeing a lot more leak codes, right? I'm seeing a lot more hacker ranks. Some of that is a function of time, right? When you have 3 applicants to a job and you've been looking for 3 months, you're like, what do I need to do, right? Let's just have one conversation and I'm gonna hope for the best. When you have 300 applicants and they're all emailing you and they're all emailing you and they all really, really want it, you have to have some sort of funnel, right? And so we are going to, and so I do understand it. I don't like it, but I do understand why it's happening more. It's let's just see how many of these 300 are willing, first of all, to spend 2 hours of their own personal time doing this leak code, and then how well do they do? And so it is a universal comparative metric, and I'm seeing a lot more of that from the hiring manager side. Seeing a lot more, the process is getting longer again, right? I'm working with a client now that's slowly coaching them out of it. But they had a 6 or 7 step interview process and they're saying, hey, it's taking me a long time to hire. And I'm like, well, it shouldn't be. But they feel each step is necessary. And the unfortunate truth is a lot of them can get away with what I would call bad hiring practices in this market because somebody else is willing to do it if you're not. And so I think you have to accept that. That is the job market, by some nature, right? It sucks. I'd say don't. It sucks now, but it also didn't 2 years ago, right? So I think there is some balance of that. That's I had people walk in and get hired after one interview because they knew if they didn't make the offer, they'd lose them, right? And so I think we have to understand there is some level of balancing. And so as much as I'm saying maybe know that the companies have the leverage right now, I'm not saying that as a universal practice. I'm saying that more as that is the nature of the time right now.
Yeah. So basically, it sucks right now. It'll probably get better at some point in time, and we have to pay attention to the job market. When we're in a boom, you won't have to focus on like learning the art of interviewing quite as much as when we're in times of lack. I don't know what the right word is for that.
Yeah. Well, I think that even goes back to the idea in my own world as a recruiter, right? The nice thing about knowing what's going on in the market is we're scaring recruiters away left and right. It used to be everybody saw there's a lot of money in it. Let's do that. It's so easy. And so let's become a recruiter. And so people were flooding into the market in droves. And I think that's kind of a similar principle that works in the job market that, I do respect it. It's super frustrating. And it's frustrating for me to watch a client, say, we're going to add a 5th step here when I told them there was only 4 and they're adding another round of some tedious interview. But I also know that if there's 3 people that, if you're feeling frustrated and there's 3 people in the process, the other 2 probably are, and at least one, maybe both are going to bail out. And you're the only one left. That makes your chances, one heck of a lot better. So I do, if you're willing to have the patience or long suffering or, in that, it certainly increases your chances. And that depends on a level of, if you're happily employed and you love your job, well, if the company has a bad interview process, just tell them to go pound it, sorry later, but it depends on your level of leverage there. And sometimes then actually believe this deeply about the holidays as well. A lot of people say, "Ooh, holidays are coming up. Let's slow down. I'm going to wait because all the jobs come back in the market on January." That is correct, except for a huge asterisk. I'll use real estate again. Anybody, if you look at the prices of houses that sell in December, it's a lot less in terms of volume, but you could get a good deal in December. Hiring is the same. There's not a lot of jobs out there, but the amount of candidates that are looking in November, December between Thanksgiving and New Year, very little. And the amount of people that are looking to hire, very little. But those that are, they're kind of desperate. Not just on the candidate side, but on the client side, I'm talking about the company's hiring. And so there'll be a much lower pool, and they really want to get you in by the end of the year. And so I actually think that's one of the best times to look for a job, in the same way that I think it's one of the best times to look for a house, is December, right? Because nobody else is doing it, and you're going to get the best deal with the least competition. And so, total adjacent aside there, but it's something I deeply believe, and I coach people on constantly. They're like, "Yeah, I'll probably start looking after the new year." Everybody else is too. Don't get the rust knocked off, get some interview practice, and you might land an awesome job in December, even though there's not many available.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. That is like completely opposite advice that I've ever heard of, but it also makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and again, I don't want to say that the quantity is out there. I think the real estate is the perfect parallel. It's, the few people you're like, somebody needed to leave at December 15th, and so they gave me a killer deal on the house, and that kind of happens a lot. And sometimes too, from a recruiting side, I don't work internal, but I've come across this enough that I would call it a trend. Recruiting and HR at an internal company, they have a budget, they have a spend that they can spend on, and that spend goes away depending on when their fiscal year ends, but that spend oftentimes will go away on January 1. So I actually have almost a top 3 month every single December, sometimes a record month in December, because a lot of these companies are saying, "Hey, Will, we have X thousand dollars to spend on you, on me as a recruiter, to fill these really hard roles, and we never had budget for it, but we have this money goes away if we don't do it now. We need someone to start before December 30th, or at least sign an offer before December 30th." And so the agency side picks up quite a bit then too, across industries.
I don't have like a business hat that I can throw on here to like do a little bit of explanation of that, but I'll do my best. The for those of us who are engineers here, which I'm imagining is almost all the viewers here right now, a lot of companies follow this really strange rule of use it or lose it, where your department, let's say you're an engineering department and you want to hire new developers, they'll give that department a budget for the entire year or the quarter. And if you fail as the manager of that department to use that budget up by the end, the next year, they reduce your budget by the amount you did not use. And so a lot of companies will be like, "Oh my gosh, we're getting up to the end of the fiscal year and I have enough budget to hire like another developer. I have to hire a developer now. And otherwise we're going to like not be able to have any budget at all next year." And it's stupid.
Mm-hmm.
It's horrible, but it happens a lot.
Yeah. If I'm a business leader, I think it's real bad. But if I'm a job seeker and that helps me get in when I've been struggling, you got to take advantage, right? So no, business hat earns. I can see it on you. Well explained.
Yeah. All right. Okay, so we had another question, which was, "I'm not the best. When we get older, being the best stops being the priority for us. Should someone like this be working as a recruiter instead?"
So the question about transitioning from a software development world to a recruiting world?
Yeah.
It's a really interesting idea, and I've seen it work well, and poorly. So I have some personal friends locally that, one, I won't share his name. He's brilliant. I care about him a lot. I helped him get his recruiting business off the ground, 2.5 years ago. I don't know that he needed my help, but it's a cheat code, right? I mean, things, I'm just a really, really good keyword matcher at this point, right? Like I know I can talk, and you think I know what I'm talking about, but I don't. I can't write a line of code to save my life. So when you actually understand the deep technical fundamentals of what you're recruiting for, man, you can do well when things are good. But I think just like software engineering is a industry in and of itself, and there's things I will never understand. I think there's some things about recruiting that are very hard for others to understand, and you have to be a student of that game to really get it. And so, in fact, I can think of 1, 2, 3 software engineers turned recruiters that did exceptionally well in 21 and 22. Right, the highs were much higher than they were for me, and I also saw those same 3 people crash hard. That's okay if you know what you're at. All 3 of them out of business now. Decided you're too hard, don't know what I'm doing. And I think my floor is a lot lower because I'm a career recruiter, right? And so in the same way that, should I transition to development when things are bad? There certainly are, recruiters doing that. And that's not a bad path either. I think as long as you know what you're getting into, I think it could be a really good path. And maybe there's a hybrid. Maybe there's a way to get more involved in the technical side of the process within a firm, because recruiting's so big in and of itself, right? I'm just a sliver. I'm agency recruiter, which means I'm only, agency is probably, I'd have to look at the numbers, 20 or 30% of the market. In the UK, it's much bigger, but in the US, it's not large. The US companies are mostly pushing for recruiters to go internal, and so hire direct instead. And I think there's a decent path in that. I think the path, you can make more money as a developer. I don't think the recruiting path is bad, but certainly not a. I think sometimes sticking it out. What's the rule? Some number of hours, and I'm going to completely butcher. Is it 30,000 hours or 7,000? There was some rule that like you could be top 1% in the world if you just spend X number of hours in that thing. And so there is something that I think people who are career switchers all the time struggle because they're chasing the next thing. That isn't 100% the case because, again, some of my friends who became recruiters, software engineering recruiters who used to be software developers, they probably doubled what I made in any given year because they were twice as good at it because they had the cheat code. So I don't know. I don't know that that's, hopefully that's the discussion that leads to some ideas more than being an answer. I don't think it's a bad idea. I'm not convinced it's a great idea either. I don't know.
Well, it's a sales position, right? And in sales, you make as much as you sell. And especially if you go into business on your own, you're going to have almost no overhead. And that fee that you get, which is that 30% fee that you normally charge?
Who?
Recruiters?
No, I would love it if it was that high. Usually, yeah. I mean, industry standard is, depending on who you ask, 20 to 25 is industry standard. But there's so many different models, right? There's staffing models, which again, in the agency world, probably if we'll say 80% is agency or is internal and 20% is agency. Of that 20%, probably another 80% does contract and temporary. So even what I do, direct hire, is a pretty small part of that world. So I'm pretty niche, and somewhere between 20 and 30 is standard for that niche. But there's a lot of hourly models that are doing well now as well, where you get paid for your time, not paid for your output. And there's arguments for and against, right? I mean, I do a lot of work that I don't get paid for, a lot. And so it's it can be very frustrating. You have to be willing to get punched in the mouth a lot in the piece that I work in, right? I mean, they always say you have to sell to the client, sell to the candidate, and then there's the human factor. So, the ups and downs are up and down. So the hourly model takes a lot of that out of the equation. And then when I can tell a client, hey, your 7-step interview process is dumb, at least I still get paid to follow your dumb process until we figure out that, I can coach you out of that, versus, when we inevitably lose every candidate to another offer 3 months in, and I've spent, 120 hours on this and I didn't earn a dime. Whew, that's frustrating, versus the hourly model is picking up because of that. The internal model is picking up because of that, which is ironic, right? Because our fees are a lot. I think that part of why the fees are a lot is because of it's a cycle that blends on itself, is because we keep I think the industry gets frustrated that a lot of times we get duds out of it. So we keep our rates pretty high to compensate for the zeros, right? So it's kind of an interesting balance that, in some ways, if I were on the hiring side, I would there would be an argument for an hourly or internal model. I think specialized niche roles, which is a lot of what I fill, right? I mean, I was talking to you the other day about this async Rust role that I was working on. Like there was 70 people that could do the job. That they wanted somebody who was in startup in the US who had been open source async. Like that's a very niche. And then I have to use my recruiting skills not just to find those people, but convince them to have a conversation with me. And they already hate me because I'm a recruiter who wants to talk to a recruiter. And that's okay. I don't mind that they hate me. But they have to convince them to talk with me, and then I have to convince them to go work at this company that I don't know much about and quit their job to do it. And that there's a lot there. But then the fees make sense, right? If I can do that, it's the fees start to make sense.
Yeah, and I guess let's talk. I know we're pretty much at the hour point, but I think it's really good, especially when we're talking about like any kind of recruiting and fees, to get some maybe assumptions out of the way, because I think that there's a lot of false sort of like information about like what the fees are and who pays the fees. So tell me a little bit more about like what, like if you're a job seeker. So if somebody is like working with you and they get hired as a programmer for a company, how does that fee? Let's just assume for easy math that they make $100,000 in a year.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So it's a finder's fee. That's the best way, the simplest way to understand it, right? The company always pays. It does not come out of your salary. It does not come out of your compensation. If it does, excuse my French, run the hell away as fast as you can. If anybody ever insinuates I do that, I've only come across it maybe twice that I can think of, where somebody was like, well, if I'm going to pay your fee, I'm going to have to pay the candidate less. I'm like, well, then you don't want to hire. That's okay. If you're hiring on your own, I'm good with that, but don't bring on a recruiter. And, I think any recruiter with any sense of self-respect or respect for the candidates they're representing, it can't be a deduction in their salary, because then ultimately the candidate is paying, and that's never the way it should work. It's just like a realtor, right? It's if you help me buy a house, like you get a fee, but if I buy 0 houses, doesn't matter if I've taken you through 20, there's no fee attached. And so the fee comes from facilitating the sale, right? It's the company, and again, it is a misconception, I think. We use the word headhunter closely with recruiter, which implies that, if Brooks is looking for a job, I'm going to help him find a job. I might help him find a job, but the person that writes my check is actually the company I work for. And so I am in the real estate world, I am the seller representative and you're the buyer, right? And so I will show you my house and I will tell you why this house might be good for you, but it might not be good for you, and that's okay. And then you don't pay anything and you walk away. And that's great. A good recruiter, just like a good real estate agent, is they're not going to sell you, they're not going to scam you. They're not going to, put snake oil on it. They're going to be a facilitator of the transaction, keeping in mind that the seller is the person that they're in charge of representing. And I think that creates, again, a misconception in the market that I have a lot of people that are like, Will, can you help me find a job? And my golly, I hope so, but it might not. And I think, again, that's why I lean toward career recruiters, not just recruiters, right? I have a lot of friends in internal, and they're very good at what they do, but their job is more than mine. I have 20, 30, 40, 50 companies, probably 50 I've represented in the last 7 years, right? So, and then I have relationships outside of that I haven't formally represented. Companies haven't hired me, but I can introduce you, right? I can say, hey, I don't work for this company, but this person you could, let me just introduce you, you talk with them. And then guess what? You remember me and they remember me when you might need a recruiter, right? But so I think an agency recruiter who's career minded, knowing that if I treat you poorly, that's my reputation for the rest of my life, for my career, right? So I don't want to paint an impression that us career recruiters are so selfish that we would not try to treat or help individuals. That is not purely the case. We have incentive, and hopefully most of us are good enough people to just like care about people. But the flip side, if I'm being blunt, I have probably 10 times a day now somebody sending me a message that says, hey, my friend was laid off, can you help them? And I want to help all of them, but I can't fill my calendar every day with everybody that's laid off unless I have a job for them. And so what I say every time now is, great, send me their resume. We'll look at it. And if I have a job that's close to what they do, I will call them. Otherwise, I'm wasting their time. They're wasting my time because I actually can't help today. It's not about not caring. That's not my job. That's a resume writer's job. It's to help, help the candidate move through the process and help them tailor or an interview coach's job, right? That there are people that do that. The recruiter's job is to help the company. And sometimes that means, sometimes that means you in the process. And I certainly hope that is right. I mean, generically, anybody I'm on the phone with. But I start every conversation exactly that way. I say, hey, look, doing this a while, going to be doing it for a long while. I hope this job's a perfect fit. I don't have a conversation unless I have a job that I think might be a fit. But I also I want to understand your fundamental goals. And so I think that's probably a sign of a really good recruiter versus not. A bad one will just tell you the job. They'll say, hey, company X growing like Y, X tech stack, X location, do you want it? And going full cycle back to the beginning of our conversation, good recruiters curious, right? They're going to say, hey, Brooks, where do you want to be in 5 years? What do you enjoy the most? What titles intrigue you? Why? What kind of people do you like to work around? What fundamentally drives you? And then they're going to say, this role that I also was curious about when I asked the manager, here's where it aligns, A, B, C, and D. Here's where it doesn't align. And so you have to look at this role as a 3-year role, not a 10-year role, or this might be a job that pays the bills, not a job that you would actually like. Or they might say, you check all the boxes, my client would love to have you. You don't want this job. And I say that 3 times a day, right? And that I love being able to say that because, again, being curious, being a consultant, I don't want you in a job you're going to quit in 6 months. That's no good for anybody. You don't win from that. I don't win from that. The clients don't win from that. And so going back to being curious and being a matchmaker, a good recruiter is going to do that. And if they're in it for the next 20 years, it might be this job. It might be the next one. It might be the one after that.
Nice. Yeah, that's a great response there. And we got Chantilly agrees with that response as well. Well, we're over the hour. I want to be respectful of your time. Do you have any sort of any sells for yourself you want to make, or any things you want to say, or how can people reach you? Do you want people to reach you?
Yeah. So kind of deflect a little bit on if somebody's saying, hey, I need a job, can you help? My answer is I'll probably send you some links unless I happen to have a job. So I'm happy to look at a resume. I'm so old school, Brooks. I have buckets, folders of, tech stack, and I got a C++ folder, and I have a Rust folder and a Python folder. And so, I'm going to put you in a box or in 2 boxes and keep your resume on file. So happy to do that. So as far as kind of how to keep in touch with me in general, I do believe, and I love the market I serve here. I love helping people. And I think it's why conversations like this are fun for me, because I do feel like I hopefully am able to instill a little bit of value into the market that may not pay me back. And that's great. But where I am trying to intentionally spend my personal time, my hobby time, willwiegert.com. I have 50 blogs that are almost written. And so I'm still in the process of going to hire somebody to help me clean it up. They're really ugly things where somebody asked me a question and, and I wrote a 2,000-word response to them. And I'm like, I should save this. Somebody, if one person asked, there's 20 other people that want to know that. So at some point, maybe I'm putting this out into the ether to hold myself accountable. There's going to be a ton of free, valuable, really good information on there. And so that's going to be my anchor point for how can I help people in mass instead of, one at a time. So that's probably the best place to follow. There's very little there now. It's a picture of my face and says Will Flawless Recruiter and a teaser. But there's some meat behind that is sitting on a Trello board that I think it's probably 50 fleshed out. I'm glad I'm not the only one that has 50 half posts written. If you have anybody that's good at turning that into a fully fleshed out grammar and spelling thing, I'll take that. But I'll also answer a this question there. Ramp up to productivity in a few months, ramped up to a top engineer in 4 to 5 years. I think companies understand that. I think also there's a cost to hiring anyone, right? Sometimes the cost is if you want somebody who's going to start today and hit the ground running today, or in a few months, the cost is hiring me, right? If you want the cost to be, hey, we're going to grab this person by the hand and help them grow, that cost is another engineer's time, right? And so I think companies in general do fundamentally understand that, which is why, as a recruiter, I almost never am going to see a job that is let's hold your hand and help you grow. I don't really see junior roles. I don't really see mid roles. I see we have pain today, and we're willing to pay you to help us find it. So I do believe that companies understand that, which makes recruiters, external recruiters, that is. Internal, different story. Internal will help you with that all day. So hopefully that helps. But a little bit tangential to our wrap up, but I thought it was a good question. I wanted to address it.
Yeah, it's a good question, but it's also one of those things where it's like, it's tough, right? Because we need to fix the entire ecosystem of engineering and software development in order to fix that, right? It's not something that just recruiters can fix. It's going to be everybody.
Yeah, and I wish, there's ever a roundtable about how to solve that, right? I deeply believe that, and I think most of us know this, and very few people, I've heard very few suggestions that I feel like have legs on how do we fix that, because the bottom level, there's a shortage of engineering talent, but most of that, boot camps, and there's been a lot of ways to create that flood, that influx of entry level, mid level, early stage engineers. But the miss is the training. It's from day one to year 3 or year 4 or year 5 that somebody's willing to hold your hand and help you and ask those tough questions and learn the things that that just took a while to learn. And that's hard, and that's the chasm that's missing. It's not a I would venture to say recruiters make that worse by nature of our job. It's like our job is to go patch holes instead of allowing, I follow college football a lot, right? And instead of developing talent, out of high school, like we're just going to go pull somebody in the transfer portal. Like that's my job. I'm the transfer portal guy, right? And that kind of sucks because it means the 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year person is just getting passed over. And I deeply, as a human side and as a person who loves this field and a person who wants to see it grow, that's the biggest chasm that I think that the market needs more work on, is how do we help? And I think AI is making that worse, right? Because we can almost cheat our way into, I think, apps can be built, and I don't understand it enough to have a deep theory on it, but I think some of the basic tasks are going to be automated, which means we're, again, skipping over this training of like some of the fundamentals, right? For me, it's how do you write a message that is compelling, right? So that's in the recruiting world, our 101, right? Like, how do we not be an asshole, right? How do you care about people? And those are like, when I've hired junior recruiters, it's that fundamental, like they need to learn what is Java versus JavaScript, right? And we laugh at recruiters because they don't know the difference, but everybody starts somewhere. And so like, I think that maybe is a good point to end on, of like being willing as a senior, if you're a senior in this world or in recruiting or in development, like the only way I believe that's going to change is that you have to be willing to volunteer or do some of the less fun things, and that's helping train and mentor other people. I don't know. I'm going down a big tangent there, but it's just something I believe so deeply, and I see a big problem in it, and I know you all do too.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a great that's a great place to leave everything off on. Will, thank you so much for coming on. This has been great. I think we answered a lot of great questions, good conversation. Hopefully it was good for you too.
Yeah, it was fun. Thanks for, you're so good at being curious. You just get me going here. I just talk and talk. So hopefully it was helpful. I had a ton of fun, Brooks. Always great to hang with you, and thanks for the time.
All right. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day. Hopefully we can do this again sometime.
You too. All right. Cheers.
Bye.